Talking about oil price being on the up again. Price of Brent crude has hit $60 a barrel. It's not been at these levels since around mid-2015. Comes amid further expectations that many oil-producing countries, particularly those from OPEC, will extend production cuts beyond March next year to the end of the year. Now, someone who's got his eye firmly on all of this is, of course, the chief executive of BP. The company's going to put out its latest results today. Bob Dudley is the man who will be doing that. He told the BBC he expects prices to remain roughly where they are now, but that means the company will need to keep reducing costs.
You can see the agreements that are in place, the OPEC, non-OPEC agreements, and the demand for petroleum products. The stock levels have continued to come down. I mean, they're heading towards the goals that OPEC set out. 45 days ago, I think the oil price was 45. So there's a lot of volatility today. There's a little bit of geopolitical reactions to things. So our planning is something between $50 and $60 for the end of the decade.
That was Bob Dudley, who's the chief executive of BP. We can speak to Steve Irwin, who is trading director at Portland Fuel now. Steve, good morning.
Morning, Sean.
Well, what's the big issue on Bob Dudley and the other chief executives of the other big oil companies at the moment?
Well, as he mentioned there, the OPEC cuts are having an effect. So we are seeing global stockpiles reduce around the world, not just in the US, but in the UK and in Asia, Europe, and in Asia as well. So as those stockpiles reduce, it obviously impedes the ability to overcome a supply shock if we were to get one.
Is it all to do with shale oil, though, at this point? That in the past it was always OPEC that sort of controlled the oil price, but now it's more like the cost structures of the US shale producers because they've just become so significant a player.
Yeah, certainly, Louise. I mean, shale oil is helping keeping prices low at the moment because it's bringing on a new source of supply that we didn't previously have. And to give you an idea, I mean, shale oil is hitting record production in the US. It's now producing over 6 million barrels a day.
Which and the Saudis, produce 13, something like that?
Yeah, about 10.5 million barrels a day. So not quite as high as they used to because obviously they've reduced their production in line with the OPEC production caps that they've got. So between 10 and 10.5 million barrels a day. The US in total is producing about the same amount, but the US uses a lot more fuel than Saudi. Obviously, they use the most amount in the world. They use about 20 million barrels a day. So they still need to import a lot of oil into the US.
So where are we at now, Steve? We spent a lot in the North Sea. We spent a lot of time talking about general job cuts that would go when the oil price fell. Then we heard about the strategy changes that big companies like BP were having to implement. What's the situation now?
Well, the North Sea is still a good producing region. Unfortunately, it is quite a high-cost producing region. So while there are other lower-cost areas that companies can invest in, the North Sea doesn't appear to be that attractive for new investment and new exploration. So we're seeing not so much new investment, but they are using new technologies to get the maximum out of the existing oil fields where they've already got wells dug.
And in terms of the price of petrol and diesel at the moment, we've had Andrew get in touch from Glasgow. Motorway garages charging £1.30 plus, whereas averages around £1.14.18 in local garages. He says the markup cannot be justified, surely, given also exorbitant food prices in there as well. When you look at petrol retailers, how much has the price at the pump and what they're having to do changed?
Well, what we're seeing from the recent rises, we expect that to translate to about a penny or two at the pumps. But one slight piece of good news is that the exchange rate is rising. The pound is strengthening against the dollar, which is keeping a lid on some of the price rises that we've seen in the dollar price of Brent, because obviously we have to convert that into pence per litre. So a rise in the exchange rate is good news, just capping the rises that we expect to see over the next couple of weeks.
Do you expect a flurry of supermarket offers in the run-up to Christmas again?
It really depends on what happens in the wholesale markets. If we see prices fall back from the recent rises that we've seen, then we may see headlines of supermarkets dropping the prices by a penny or two, which will simply reflect the drops that we see in the wholesale market.
And got to ask you before we go, Steve, what's your tip for shopping around for fuel? Do you drive a certain distance to get a cheaper petrol?
No, not at all. I mean, the amount that you can save is offset by the cost of the fuel that you spend driving around to look for it, I think. So I find a fairly cheap site that's local to me, and I stick to that one.
Interesting, like Andrew in Glasgow. Steve, thank you very much for that. Steve Irwin there, Trading Director at Portland Fuel.